To start, can you say your name and spell it?
Judith Meierhenry, Judithmeierhenry.
And you understand we're recording this for the South Dakota State Historical Society?
I do.
And you give your permission?
I do.
All right, very good. I'm Tony Venhuizen, I'm the interviewer today, and we're going to start with your early life. If you could kind of talk about where you're from, where you grew up, who your parents were, how your family came to South Dakota.
That might take the whole two. I was born in 1944 in south of Dallas. I'm a farm girl. And I grew up on a farm south of Dallas, South Dakota. The farm was homesteaded by my grandma and grandpa in 1905. And we still have that farm today. We still have the land. I grew up there. I went to a one-room schoolhouse a half a mile away, all 8 grades. My parents both were from that area, had grown up there. Of course, my dad did, because that was the homestead. And my mother's family lived close by. So those two were born in 1905 and 6, my parents were, and neither one of them were able to be educated beyond the 8th grade. But they always thought that all of us kids needed to go on. Education was very important in the family, and we all did. I was the youngest of 4 siblings, and my next oldest sibling is 10 years older than I am, so my siblings were older. And so I kind of grew up as a only child for most of my time and entertained myself on the farm and things like that.
Dallas is in Gregory County?
It's in Gregory County. And then I went to Gregory High School. I graduated in 1962 and then went on to USD to get my undergraduate, graduate, and law.
And your husband, Mark, was also from that area,
He grew up in Gregory. We were both born in 1944, which the war was still going on. His family actually came from Nebraska, but he was a war orphan. His father was killed in the Second World War. And his grandfather, his mother's father, worked on the railroad, and he was the section boss in Gregory, because in those days we had lots of railroads. And so then when Mark was born, or when Mark was a baby, then his mother moved back to Gregory to be with her parents. So he grew up in Gregory.
So you went to Gregory High School, you went to USD.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about that, being at USD. What did you study and what was that like?
We graduated in high school in 62, started in college right away, graduated in 66. I was an English major. Those were the days when, there weren't a lot of opportunities for women. You could go be a teacher, nurse, secretary, and as I always say, if you were really adventuresome, you could become an airline stewardess. But mainly that was, if you were going to go on to any kind of further education and career, those were the opportunities. My sister and brother were both educators, and so I knew about that, and I knew I always wanted to be an English major. So I ended up with an education degree, and after graduation, then that's what I started out as, a teacher.
And were your children born in this time also?
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Mark and I were married all through college, and we had Todd most of the time, and then my daughter was also. So I had 2 little babies while I was going to college.
So then after college, did Mark go to law school right away?
No, we were out. He graduated in 1970. No, he graduated. Okay, I got to remember the dates here. He actually graduated from law school in 1970, so he worked for a while, for a couple of years. And I had taught, and then we moved back to Vermilion, and he went to law school, and then I worked on my master's in English, and I got my master's in a year and a half. And then I was hired on, luckily, as an instructor at the University of South Dakota in the English department. So I taught freshman English at USD for a couple of years. And then we went to Nebraska, which didn't work out real well. I was teaching at a college down there. It was called Hiram Scott College, and it was in those days where they thought they could have private colleges that they could actually make it with just charging tuition and things, and that did not work out very well. So we were kind of depending on my salary, and Mark was starting a practice with two of his classmates there. And the college closed. It just went broke and closed. So then we ended up back in South Dakota. A friend of ours that we had known from undergraduate, Bill Janklow, was out on the reservation as the head of legal aid. And he wanted Mark to come back and work in legal aid. And so that's how we got back to South Dakota. And then eventually to Todd County, and I taught high school there for 3 years while Mark was working in legal aid. And our kids went to school out there.
So going back a little, you were friends with Bill Janklow even in college.
Right.
Talk a little more about that.
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, we met him through a friend of a friend, and our group of people were married students, and Bill Janklow was married. He and Mary Dean were married. And we met him through, I think, another married couple that we were friends with, and he was in law school, I believe, really, when we met him. Anyway, we got to be good friends. Our kids played together. We socialized, which meant we went to their house or they came to our house, and that's when we met. That's when we met Bill, and so we had known him from Bill and Mary Dean from way back.
So then, after all that, you were in Todd County, and you said you were teaching.
I taught in Todd County. I taught English, high school English then, for 3 years out there.
And Mark was working for
legal aid.
with Janklow.
He started out with Janklow was the director of legal aid, and then Janklow left, and then Mark became the director of legal aid. That's where he wanted Mark to come back and take over that.
What was it like in Todd County back in those days?
Well, it was between 70, it was, let's see, we were there, 74 is when we left. So this was all time when the Wounded Knee was going on. That was in the Pine Ridge, and we were on the Rosebud Reservation. So we didn't really get as much involved. I had students that would go back and forth, and of course, it was, you look back on it, it might have been a scary time. There was a lot of things going on, and a lot of political things that went on. And my students were involved in it, or sympathizing or not sympathizing with AIM and what they were trying to do out there. And it was an interesting time. It was also the time of the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson. And there were lots of federal programs that were good programs that dumped a lot of money into education. So actually, Todd County was a larger high school. We had a lot of the most current equipment, textbooks, good students, smart kids, good, most of the faculty, we had masters. And so it was a good school, it was a good time. Poverty was like it is, but we had such great hopes during the Great Society and all those programs. But there were some great programs that were designed to provide some good education for the students out there, the elementary and the high school.
So after that, did you go back to Vermilion then?
Yes. It was during that time that I decided, because I taught high school, college for about 9 years. And I thought, I love to teach, but it wasn't something I could see myself doing for my whole life and my whole career. And so, of course, I'd known lawyers for years and married to one, and our best friends were all lawyers. And I thought, and of course, mostly men. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do something else, that might be something I'd really be interested in. And I figured I was as smart as most of those people that I knew, and there were not very many women in law school when Mark was there, maybe under 6 or so in the whole law school. I had known some of those women, and I really liked the women that were in law school when Mark was in law school. So, I did know some women that had gone on and become lawyers, and so it dawned on me one day that might be what I wanted to, that might be a path I could take. I talked to Mark about it, and he was very supportive. He thought it was a good idea. I talked to some other lawyers that I knew that were friends, and they thought it might work, and so Mark went back, he went back to Vermilion, and he started his own law practice there, and then I went to law school.
You remember how many women were in your class?
We always debate about that. I always say around 20, it was at least 20%. But when I look, our class, which we started in 1974, was the first law school class at the University of South Dakota that had any number of women. I mean, we had a group. I mean, we were like at least 20%, we think. Although now I found a picture, so I'm going to go back and count for sure. But there were quite a few women in my class, and it didn't dawn on me at the time. I guess that I think it all had to do with Title IX. Doing research on Title IX years later, it was like, well, now it makes sense, because Title IX required that the universities provide for women and in equal numbers, or really push that for faculty and entry into the professional schools. And I think that made a difference. So I think it was tied to that same time frame, that then there were more women were in professional schools. Before that, you couldn't. Business school, veterinary school, medical school, they just weren't letting women in. And so I think it's kind of tied to that period of time, which I'm very thankful for.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was expecting it to be a much lower number.
Right,
Because
but ours was...
I know people just before you were in law school, and they'd always say it was just a handful.
That's exactly right. But I think that's, I really do think that's what it was. It was a push, and it was like, hey, we've got to let women in, and we were we met all the qualifications, so it was good. And we never thought much about it, because there were enough of us, and we were law students, We happened to be women, but we were law students.
Of course, you go down there today, it's probably majority women.
Yeah, well, it's at least 50-50,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. All right, so when did you finish law school then?
77.
77. So did you practice in Vermilion?
I did. And then a political bug bit Mark, and then he ran for Attorney General, and then we went to Pierre.
Talk a little bit about that, because he didn't work in the Attorney General's office for
No,
very long. How did
did-
he come to run, and what was that like?
Well, again, I go back to our good friend Bill Janklow. Bill Janklow was the Attorney General at that time, and he had hired Mark to do special assistant AG work for different cases in the state, and particularly some of the more high-profile ones, and I think he was encouraged by Bill, and why not? We were still young enough and still believed we could make a difference, and so we all headed to Pierre.
I think it's true. Did
Janklow was sworn in as governor right on New Year's Eve at
Yes.
midnight, and Mark was sworn in. Can you talk a little about that? I've maybe even heard this from you before, or Mark.
Oh, it could be. Well, yes, because Governor Janklow was the Attorney General. He won the governor's office, and Woolman was in as the governor because Janklow beat him, and so I don't know exactly why, but somehow the powers that be, particularly Bill Janklow, I think, decided that he wanted to take over, which you can, I mean, first of the year. So we all got gussied up and went over to the Capitol, the governor's office, in the outside chamber, and they got sworn in a little after midnight on the 1st of January. And then the rest is history.
So when you guys moved to Pierre, then you worked in the Janklow administration, is that right?
I did. I wanted to be, my initial plan was to practice law, continue to practice law, because that's what I'd gone to law school to do. It was a little bit difficult to find a position where I could be a lawyer where there was not a conflict of interest. So most of the lawyers that work for the government are assistant AGs. I guess I didn't know that, or it didn't dawn on me that that might be a problem. I almost, this is another story, but I almost went to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office, but politics got in the way of that, and I didn't get the final signature, which is another story for another day. But so then Janklow called me, and it was later. He had gathered his people to go through all you've probably been through this, the big book, to figure out what positions are even there, what the government agencies are, what they needed, who was still there, who wasn't there, who's going to stay, who wasn't. So they were in the process of doing that, and he calls one night, and I would guess it was like 9, 10 o'clock at night, because they were working on that, and time was never an issue with Janklow. He could call you at any time. So, and he said, I want you to come to work, and I want to send you over to the Department of Energy. There was a Department of Energy in those days, really totally funded by the federal government. And he said, I want you to go over there and figure out what's going on with it, and I'll point you to go over there and I was like, really? So I went over there and spent a couple weeks going through, figuring out the budget, figuring out who's who and what they did, and then came back and reported. And then not too long after that, he calls, again, probably late at night, and he said, I want you to go to the state how about if I appoint you to the director, it was director, because it was part of the executive branch, Director of State Economic Opportunity Office, which was the old OEO. All the government programs came through there, the weatherization programs, the community action programs. It was a big budget office, but it was all federal government. And I said, oh, Bill, I don't know, these are all poverty programs. Are you sure that this is, do I really want to do that? So I said, let me think about it. So I hung up, and of course I called him back about a half hour later, and Mark and I talked to him. He said, well, if you don't accept it, he'll probably not ask you again. So I called him back, and I said, I'll take it. Okay, I'll take it. I don't know what I'm getting into, but I will. And he said, what, your old man told you to take it, didn't he? I said, well, he thought it might be a good idea. So that was what so I went over there, and I was at this, I was the director of the State Economic Opportunity Office, I think for about a year, and then he appointed me to be the Secretary of Labor, which fit better with my background because it had all the, It had all the unemployment hearings examiners, it had the workers' comp, lawyers that worked there, and it fit more, and I'd always been interested in labor law anyway. I mean, that was all employment law and so forth. So it really did fit with an interest of mine. It was a good time.
You did that for several years.
Yes, until I came, then I went to work for Citibank over here in 1985. So it was till about then I went from 80 to 85, I think is when I was over there.
Were you Secretary of Education too?
That's a whole nother story, yes. For about 18 months, I had them both.
Oh, you did them both?
I did them both.
Oh, I didn't understand.
Yes. Janklow decided that we could merge the two because they had a lot of the same programs, right? And so we did them both I did them both for about 18 months, yeah.
I'd seen both on your
Yes.
whatever bio
Yes.
I read, but it wasn't clear. I thought you moved from one to the other.
No, I did them both.
So you mentioned the midnight phone calls. Janklow was also famous for, were you ever on the receiving end of a tantrum or a...
You know, I think I was lucky because we had known each other for so long, and we went back so far, and he you know, he would go into, he could do, not, I wouldn't say a tantrum, but he would get something in his head. This is what we need to do. This is what we need to do. We should do this. We should do that. And he'd call you over there, and you'd go over there. And it was like, particularly with the Department of Labor, probably his education too. You know, we need to do this. And he'd get on it. And then what I would usually do, because I knew the program and I knew the agency better, obviously, and I would say, okay, you know, we can do this, but be aware we could do this. You know, this is it might not work, and these are the downside, and this is, you know, here, but we'll make it work if that's what you want to do. So I would go through that with him, and then I would go back, and, well, he would leave, you know, nope, we're gonna do that. And I would go back to the office, and then I would wait for a while. I mean, I'd maybe sit on it for a few days. And then, because I knew him well enough, that he listened. He always listened to you. You heard, he absorbed everything you said. And he listened, and he knew, and he trusted what I was telling him. And then he'd call back and he'd go, yeah, you know, I've changed my mind on that. And I was lucky enough that, I mean, we had a good working relationship. So I was never really on the end of any, but I was there and saw some.
So after that, you made the move to Sioux Falls
Mm-hmm.
and work for Citibank. That's around the time that Mark would have been done as AG.
Right,
Maybe a
right.
little earlier.
Yeah, he was still down there. He was still back there, and I commuted.
And what did you do? I mean, Citibank would have been just new to South Dakota at that time.
It was pretty new, and of all things, they hired me to set up the user services department between the business end of it and the IT. So I really worked with all the computer people, the programmers, the people who run the mainframe. They had mainframes here, and the network. That was just brand new. We had when they started the satellite. So of course I did the closest I would have come to being a technical person in that is I did minor in computer science when I got my master's. This was an old, we learned the programs and we fed them in with the cards in this machine that would have filled it was the beginning of it. So I didn't, I really wasn't familiar with it, but I learned a lot real fast, and and it was new too. I mean, the technology was, but they had brought in the top-notch technology people that were working right here, and I worked beside them, and then I learned what they did, and then I could talk the English part of it to translate between the business end and the technical world. And I worked for a guy by the name of Stojak. He's the one that hired me. And then I ended up, actually, when I left Citibank, Fred Winkler became the president at that time, and I was in the legal department at the end. I worked in the legal department, because it was about that time I decided I really wanted to get back into the law, and I thought about being a judge and set my sights on that.
All right, do you want to, you need a drink of water or anything?
That would be good.
Yeah, we can wait for a second.
You need a drink of water too.
So at any rate, I think it was in 1988 you were appointed as a circuit judge.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about why that was an ambition of yours, how you went about applying, what was it like applying and getting that appointment?
There were no women on the bench at all at the time in 1988. There was a woman judge, Mildred Remiecki, up in the northeast part of the state that had been a county judge, and when they reorganized the government, or when they did the unified judicial system, she then became a circuit court judge. I need another drink. But by 1988, she'd already retired, so there were no women. And Governor Mickelson was the governor at that time, and I think they really believed that we needed to open more doors for women. I mean, that's my politically, for doing the right thing, whatever. And I didn't really, I knew Governor Mickelson. He was in the legislature when we were up there. You know, I'd known him some, but he was not anybody I'd campaigned for or anything like that, necessarily. But because partly I did get his ear to a certain extent through my good friend Lee McCarran, who was a lawyer in Vermilion, and we were good friends of McCarran's, and McCarran was his brother-in-law. So I had a little bit of a help there. But also, I will tell you, in that time, you know, you learn a lot about politics, as you very well know, when you get in the thick of it, and you know how things work. If you haven't been through it, and you haven't been to peer, and you haven't been politically active, you know, it just helped. It helped to know how you got somebody's attention when it's a political appointment. And I had worked, when I moved to Sioux Falls, I was very active in the Republican Party here. I was the chairman of the Lincoln Day Dinner, you know, and I was new to Sioux Falls, so that was an in on. In fact, Ron Williamson and I were both on the committee for the Lincoln Day Dinner, because I'd known Ron too. And so, you know, I still maintained some being quite active and knew a lot of people still in state government and around the state, which helped. I was a little older, you know, I'd been out and about. I was about, I think I was 44. I was born in 44. It would have been at the end of the year. So I had applied. There was a position open in Lincoln County, which would have been the First Circuit. It was in Canton. I had applied through the process, which you apply and you go and you interview to the judicial committee. Qualifications committee. I think they called it something else then too, but anyway, so I'd interviewed for that job, and Mickelson, so my name had been circulated once, and Mickelson appointed Judge Bogue to take that position. So then Judge Heerman retired here in Sioux Falls, which was even better for me, and so I applied for that and was lucky enough to interview, get through the process. My name went up, and Governor Mickelson appointed me.
And you were the only woman judge at that time?
I was.
I hadn't realized. I met Mikey a couple times. I didn't realize she had already retired.
She had already retired. There was one other judge that was a magistrate judge in Maridale Cody. I can't think, there might have been one other part-time woman, I don't know, as a magistrate, I can't remember that. But all the circuit court judges were men. And they were till, for several years, I was the only woman. So I'd go to a meeting and that was it. So then I think Governor Mickelson, then the next woman that he appointed in this area was Judge Caldwell. And then there were two of us. And then I think Judge Trandle from that winter area was next. So when Judge Trandle came on, we told her, you know, the one thing about having few women is there's not a line in the bathroom.
Of course, now this circuit is a majority.
Yeah, now this
You know
circuit, right.
Yeah. Talk about being a circuit judge. What was that like? Did you enjoy it?
Oh, I did. I liked the circuit. I really liked circuit court judge, being a circuit court judge. There's, at least back in my day, there were a lot of trials. There were a lot of, you know, not as much. Now it's become more motion-driven, I think, the legal profession. You know, summary judgment motions were few and far between, and now you get one in every case, I think. So it's changed, but in those days you saw a lot of lawyers, you had a lot of hearings, there was a lot of activity going on in the courtroom. And of course we did everything. We did from criminal to divorce to child protection stuff, just everything. You know, you did everything, including small claims. When I first went on, the circuit court judges did their turn doing small claims. And there was always activity. It's very transactional, and you get to see a lot of the lawyers, and I've always really enjoyed lawyers. I mean, they're good people. And I liked seeing the litigants. I mean, they all have stories to tell, and they're not always at their best when they're in court, but I think my literature background and my love for literature helped me understand people and enjoy the whole thing.
The Second Circuit here in Sioux Falls is always a very busy circuit.
It is.
Too.
Mm-hmm. It was very busy. There were only 5 circuit court judges at the time. And at one point, we lost one of my colleagues, R.D. Hurd, died suddenly in his sleep in his early 50s. So then we were down to 4. And then until we got somebody appointed to fill it. And I think then there was one of them, Judge Hagee, was ill or something, and so one of them ended up kind of in the hospital for a while, so we were scrambling to keep up. And then they would bring in judges from other circuits to help us out from time to time. So that, it did help us, but we did get through it. And of course now, what do they have, 10, 12? I don't know how many they have, they keep adding now.
I was going to say 12 or 13. I
Well,
think,
it could be, because
they're
they
still busy.
and they just got a new position, I think, yeah. They're very, very busy here.
How do you think that has changed over time? Of course, Sioux Falls is a much bigger town.
Right, right.
There's also just more in society coming into the courthouse. It seems
I
like.
think so, and I still stay in touch with all the circuit court judges. We have a luncheon every month, and we get together, and I enjoy it because I kind of hear what is going on, and I like to find out. But I think there's a lot. Well, the same ills of society, of course, they see them, you know, and the drugs and the kinds of drugs and the devastation that causes to not only the person but the families, and I mean they're seeing a lot more of that, which is very difficult. And the other thing that has really changed is so much more pro se litigation. We had very little of that, and now that's a big part of it as well.
Creates a lot of work for the judge.
It does. It creates a lot of work for the judge.
So, and you were the presiding judge for
I was,
quite a bit of that time.
yeah. I don't remember how many years, but yeah, about half of it.
So 2002 rolls around, late 2002, and you're appointed to the Supreme Court. I remember that personally. I was working for Mike Rounds' transition office upstairs.
Okay.
I think he'd been elected 4 or 5 days earlier?
It's
So we were
probably.
just kind of moving into the Capitol, and then that appointment was announced.
Right, it was late November, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Talk about how that happened. Of course, Governor Janklow was.
Governor Janklow was the governor at that time, and I have always been very active in encouraging women and diversity, particularly, but in my case, women, on the bench, because I think it's important that the judiciary reflect the society you're in. And of course, 50% of the society are women. And more women were professionals, they were educated, so, you needed, and we had arrived at a point where there were a lot more women in the legal profession who were very well qualified, very well qualified. That was always the beginning of it. Well, they haven't had experience, they haven't been out long enough, they're not qualified. They're qualified. And in fact, some of them were probably more qualified than some of the men that had been appointed. But so that was something that I really had worked hard on and did as much as I could to get that accomplished. And when we were the last state in the union to have that never had a woman on the South Dakota Supreme Court. So it was time. And so when I decided I was going to apply, I obviously felt I was qualified, and having been on the bench as long as I had, and so I applied for it. It fits into my what I like to do. I like to do research. I love the law. I'd done circuit court work for almost 15 years, and I thought, why not? So I went for it and talked to Governor Janklow. I said, it's time, we need a woman. and luckily he agreed. And so I'm very thankful for that.
I'm trying to think how to ask this. I was doing an interview about Governor Janklow not that long ago, and I made the point that I don't think he gets a lot of credit for, he really did a lot to advance women in state government.
He did.
I believe. Well, why don't I just start by asking about that, because you'd be
He
a good
did.
example of that.
He did. He had women on the cabinet, women in levels of authority all over the government. He did that way back. And I always thought too that there wasn't enough credit given to Governor Janklow or the Republicans, I think. There was always sort of that feeling that maybe only the Democrats appointed women. And that was not the case. I mean, and Janklow did a lot for that. And he did, and he didn't get as much credit. But, I'll tell you though, Governor Dugard did a tremendous amount for the judiciary. He appointed lots of women. And one of the things when I retired in 2011 and I decided I was going to retire, you have to retire at 70, but I was a little bit younger, almost 68, when I decided life was short and I wanted to do some other things. And I wanted to give the next generation the opportunity to move into those positions. And so I had specially made a trip. I got in my car and drove all the way to Pierre to deliver my retirement letter to the Governor Dugard, because I wanted to talk to him. He was a lawyer, but there was kind of this feeling among lawyers, well, we've got quite a few women. Well, we didn't on the bench. I mean, it may look like we do, but we didn't. And I wanted to make sure, and that's what I voiced my concern that, when I retire, I was afraid it would go back and we'd have 5 men again, and just how important it was to get women on the bench. And so I had done my homework. I knew the statistics and how many women are in the bar and how long I had been out. And when I talked to him, I mean, he was so open. I mean, it was like, yeah, I agree with you. and sat down with me and started writing notes. And I was so impressed because I didn't know him that well, and I didn't know what kind of a response I was going to get. So then I asked him, because it was early, it was May, I think, and then I was actually, maybe, I don't know, anyway, it was May or June. And the bar convention was coming up, and it was here in Sioux Falls. And I said, if I would get would you be willing to attend a coffee or a gathering of as many women lawyers that I know that are interested in, have either applied or interested or good candidates to be judges? Would you be willing to come and at least meet and greet or say a few words? Absolutely. So then it was like 2 weeks away. So I came home and got my friends, and we went through got the thing all lined up. And he met and talked to all of them and was so open on how he chose what he went through to choose his judges when the positions opened up. And it was such a delight, and to see his open and willingness to support women in those positions. And he did a lot. He appointed a lot of women. But I wanted him to see a whole room of qualified women, and he did.
I remember that. I think the number of women judges doubled while he was governor.
I think that's right.
And of course, he appointed Justice Wilbur to replace you and
Right.
Justice Kern. You're talking about the Supreme Court then. I have a couple questions about that. First one, you've been on the circuit bench for a long time. You talked about how you like that. Now you're on the Supreme Court. It's interesting because generally people move from circuit judge to Supreme Court justice, but they're really very different jobs.
They are.
Can you kind of talk about how was that different, and did you like it? Are there things about you like more or less, or looking back at it now?
Well, there's good and bad in both of, or I mean, not so much bad, but there's different things, and things I liked about both of them. The circuit court judge, you are in charge of your courtroom. You have to make the decisions, you call the shots. If you have a jury, you're there directing the whole thing. You're making rulings, you're instructing the jury on the law. It's your courtroom. And then if the judge has to make a decision either on evidence or actually make a decision in a case, a final decision, it's your decision. And you make the decision, you do the best you can, and then if they appeal it, you figure Supreme Court will review it. If I was wrong, fine. Or if I was right, great. So you do it as best as you can. And but it's fun because you're in charge, and you get to decide, and you get to orchestrate how the trial goes, how the whole thing plays out, and to make sure that all the litigants, all the lawyers get a fair hearing, and so you are in charge of doing that. And it's transactional. People are there, the litigants are there, you see them all, you interact, you see what's going on. When you go to the Supreme Court, everything's by review on a cold piece of paper. Well, now it's on your iPad, but it's words and exhibits, and you really don't see or you don't get the dynamics of the courtroom. You don't even get the dynamics of the body language or anything that's going on. It's really the record you're looking at. But as a trial court, though, you are bound, and you must look at it with a certain standard of review. So you shouldn't, as a trial or as a review court, look at it and say, well, that's not the decision I would have made, or that's not how I would have handled this. You have to look at it to see, is it follow the standard of law, or does the judge have discretion in this case, and the judge did not abuse its discretion. Even though I may not agree with that way the judge decided it, there's nothing wrong with it. The judge had the discretion. You defer to the judge, the trial court judge, because they were there, they were in the middle of it, they saw the litigants, they heard all the evidence, and there's just a certain amount of deference you give to them. And then some things are just law. They're just absolutely, what's the right law here? And a lot of things will come up the Supreme Court we've never ruled on before. So you do a lot of research. And I've always liked research, and of course, coming from the English background, I love to write. So those two things were they were perfect. I really liked it. And it was a good opportunity towards the end of my career to have that advancement into that area, and then to have some impact on being able to write and the difference, however, and I think, in fact, I just heard Justice Kavanaugh from the U.S. Supreme Court speak at the Eighth Circuit, and he was also indicating the difference between being on the trial court and appellate is that now all of a sudden you don't get to make the decision yourself. You have to have, at least in my case, 2 other people agree with me, which is a whole different ballgame. And that was, that takes a while to figure out, okay, because 5 people don't always agree, and they may agree on the result, but they don't like the way you've said this, or they don't like the way you've gotten there. So you need, it's a different way of working and arriving at a decision. So those are the differences. So that took me a while to get used to that.
Are there any, and maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, are there any cases or decisions that stand out to you as being particularly memorable?
People ask me that, and I don't know. I think I mean, this sounds just, you probably can't believe this necessarily, but every case is important when it comes up to the Supreme Court, and you really do look at it that way. I was not involved in any cases that shut down the lottery or anything like that. We didn't have those kinds of cases when I was up there. We had the fun ones were, the constitutional issues that would come up, the First Amendment kinds of issues, or just even interpreting South Dakota statute that hadn't been before. I like property law, and I really liked some of the property cases that came up just on an intellectual basis of trying to figure that out. There were some water cases that early on that I had a lot of fun doing. So I can't say that there's one that really stands out for me.
Mark's practice was a lot of property and water law later, wasn't it?
It was. He did condemnation and.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was. As I was getting ready for this morning, I looked up at my wall in my office, and I have my bar admission certificate, which you were kind enough to sign.
Good.
And the others who signed it. I was thinking about it because there was a group who was on the Supreme Court together for a pretty long period of time on program. And I wondered, and they're all people who I knew and admired. I wonder if we could just talk about each of them a little bit and share a couple thoughts about them, starting with Chief Justice Gilbertson.
He was on all the while I was, and of course he took over as the chief from Justice Miller when he retired. So he was already the chief when I came on, and he was just I knew them all because I had been on the circuit court bench for so long, so I did know them all, considered them friends. But it was really a cordial group. We got along. I mean, even if we disagreed on whether a case should be decided this way or that, we'd go out for dinner together, and we'd always enjoyed each other's company. We'd laugh, have a glass of wine, and kid the ones that like box wine as opposed to bottled wine. But we had a good time. We got along, and I can't complain at all. It was a very cordial group. you can't always say that about the South Dakota Supreme Court if you go back historically. And there were times that it was not as much fun, I think, and it wasn't as collegial. But the group, I was very happy that I had such a collegial group to work with. And maybe you give credit to the chief for that, Gilbertson. He set the tone. He was very open, always cared about how everybody was doing. Just a real solid human being. And I think that sets the tone to a certain extent. And then you couldn't find a nicer guy than Konekamp, Justice Konekamp. He was just peach of a person and very polite and bright and caring too. Just a very nice person. Justice Zenner and I had been on the bench together, the circuit court bench, for all those years. Our mutual friend, Governor Janklow.
You were appointed the same year, I think.
Yes, earlier, right, yeah. Right. So we both came on that same year. And both came off the trial court bench. And so that was fun because I knew Justice Zenner before he had his accident. We go back that far because he was working in the AG's office at that time. Or no, he was working, he was at one time, and then he was in private practice, I think, but we were in Pierre when that happened. And so followed him, and what a bright human being he was to work with, and he kept you on your toes. And he worked untold hours, the midnight oil burned with him. He worked and worked and worked, but he was very, intellectually, it was very much, he and I really, because we came on at the same time, I think, and had sort of the same experience in the trial court bench, one of the things that we really discussed a lot, and I think we got it moving, was to always have the standard of review and be clear about what the standard of review was. Because if you read some of the old cases, they didn't even talk about the standard of review. And on that level, it's very important that you know what your role is and then how are we reviewing this, by what standard, whether it was abuse of discretion or whatever it might be. And he and I were pretty convinced that we needed to push it, and every case needed to have the standard of review in it. And so that was fun. I think we got some things accomplished there. Justice Sabers, I had not known as much. He wasn't on a trial. He was the only one that hadn't come from the trial court bench. But he was in Sioux Falls, and so I got to know him sort of as having our offices next to each other, and we rode back and forth quite a bit. And he was fun. He enjoyed. He set the example of having just loved his job. And he was a good role model because he'd been on there a long time. And he'd been through some courts that weren't as collegial. So he enjoyed it too, yeah.
Yeah, it happened to me more than once that I would go to dinner at La Minestra, and there's the Supreme Court
Yep.
over in the corner. Even after you had left, I think they still go down.
Oh, I think they do.
Yeah.
I think they do, yeah.
I bought a clock from Chief Justice.
Oh, yes, well, good.
He was moving out of his office. I went down there to see him for some reason, and he said his wife has told him that nothing else was coming home.
Okay.
So he was down to the point where he was selling stuff out of his office. Well, I think I've covered just about everything I had. Is there anything else you want to talk about or mention that we haven't covered?
Not so much. I can't think of
I
any.
should ask, so you retired in 2011.
Yes.
What has the last 10 or 12 years been? What have you been doing?
I'm always busy. I started out, actually I had a list of to-dos, which some of them are still to do. But one of the things that when I transitioned off, because you do worry about that. I know Justice Sabers just hated to retire because he didn't know what he was going to do. And I just thought that was not a good plan. You needed to stay busy, and I was still young enough that I had plenty of things I wanted to do. But one of the things I did when I decided to retire, I said to Justice Gilbertson, the chief, I said, one of the things, we always had a trainer that came in from the law school to train us on criminal law, and would go through the latest Supreme Court cases on criminal law and update the trial court judges. It was the most favorite thing on the agenda every year at the training, and the judges. It was the criminal law professor from the University of South Dakota. So I said to the chief, and I said, you know, the biggest issue we've got when we see these cases come up is that the trial court judges are not as, the depth of their knowledge in civil cases isn't, I mean, a lot of them come out of the prosecutors or public defenders, mostly prosecutors' offices. They know criminal law, but they don't know civil law. And it's very complicated because there's so many areas of it. And I said, you know, I'd be willing to do some training that would be comparable to the criminal part of it, and I would do the civil. So I did that for about 5 years. So what I did then is I would read, which forced me to read all the U.S. Supreme Court civil cases that would apply, and, you know, patent law and some of these other things were not as, or they're just, where they're interpreting federal law, it wasn't appropriate, but all the other cases, and all the South Dakota Supreme Court cases, and I do a little synopsis, make an outline, and go through it all. It wasn't, then I really questioned my knowledge and sanity, because when I added it all up, about 75% of the cases are civil. And I was like, wow, I had never figured that out. You know? Anyway, so I did that for about 5 years. So it kept me active in that area, you know, because I'd read all the cases, particularly all the civil cases. It forced me then to break them down into a way that I could tell the circuit court judges what's important, what the holding of the case is, what they need to know going forward. And I could do that because I've been there. And it'd be like, okay, the Supreme Court South Dakota Supreme Court came out and said you got to do these 5 things in a custody case. So don't forget these 5 things. And so that was fun, actually. And then I got to stay in touch with the judges for another 5 or 6 years, and then at some point, you know, it was a lot of work, and I decided that I needed to retire from that as well. And then what I actually did, something entirely different, and using a different part of my brain, I took watercolor lessons, and I started painting. So I paint, and I do watercolors. So that's.
They're for sale?
No, I'm not sold any. But I have given them away, let's put it that way.
Well, maybe I'll trade you for one.
Yeah. And so anyway, I've done that, and then I had a place in Tucson. We had a place in Tucson. We'd go down there in the wintertime and met some people down there, did some things, and then my husband got sick, and so the last 3 years I've been by myself. And then before that, you know, a good 2 years he had to retire, but he didn't retire soon enough that we could have done a few more trips. But, you know, life happens.
You don't really sit with the Supreme Court anymore, do you? I know
I'm still on call if they
do?
need me. Yeah, they still keep me on contract if they need me. But I haven't gone up there for a few years, but maybe 2 or 3. But yeah, every once in a while. You probably don't see it. It might be one that they don't have oral argument. But one of the fun things I did do after I retired is when the 2 women were on the Supreme Court, and let's see, how did this work? I don't remember what year it was, but I asked the chief, I said, would you at some point call me up to sit on a case where all of them are women? And so he did. There was a case where he had recusals, so he brought me back, and then the 2 sitting Supreme Court justices. Oh, I think actually there were 2 retired. So Lori and I both went up, Lori Wilbur, Justice Wilbur, and then the 2 sitting, and then another woman was brought up. So that we had 5 women on the Supreme Court hearing that case, and that was fun, and he did it for me.
Neat.